unforgettable moment unfolded when a doctor, in a burst of frustration, snapped, "If you want to take care of patients without insurance, you should go to Africa." This shocking comment was a glaring example of the dysfunction within the healthcare system. One of many experiences that caused a seasoned nurse to question the value she believed the profession stood for. Today, we're going to explore the stories and challenges that reshaped her perspective and set her on a transformative new path. Welcome to the It's Your Story to Tell podcast, and today I have Tammy here with me. She is a former labor and delivery nurse who has a remarkable journey that took her from the trenches of bedside nursing to a mission of empowering others through nurse coaching. Thank you so much, Tammy, for being here with me today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. This is super exciting. I appreciate it.
Well, I always like to start out with people getting a chance to get to know our guests. So what inspired you to become a nurse, and maybe even a little bit about why you chose labor and delivery?
Yeah, that's a great question. What inspired me to become a nurse? I actually don't know. In fact, when I had decided to become a nurse, which was like my senior year, like end of junior year, beginning of senior year of high school, I remember going to my sisters and saying, "I think I want to be a nurse." And they're like, "Well, you've always wanted to be a nurse. You said that you wanted to be a nurse when you were 6." And I have zero recollection of that. So I was like, "Really?" And they were like, "Oh my gosh, you said that a long time ago." So clearly it was there. Not sure why. I do know this sounds probably a little bit silly, but always wanted to take care of things, right? Like my baby dolls, and like I would find stray animals in our neighborhood, which is really strange because I have never, since I've been an adult, seen a stray animal in my neighborhood. But like growing up, they were there all the time. I feel like I would take in the injured ones and try to nurse them back to health. So in me, I don't know really how to explain kind of where nursing itself came from, except for that it is the business of caring, and that feels and still feels really good to me. And so that's where, somewhere deep down nursing came born with it. I'm not sure, but the labor and delivery part of it, I have always been very interested in babies, and especially babies. The idea of like being pregnant and having a baby was just the most fascinating thing to me. And so when I saw, because I lived with two sisters, and my mom and my dad, but there was no boys to understand. So like going to school and learning about boys, like that's kind of where relationships, that's where I learned about it, right? Between our friends and like other kids, but there weren't boys around even in our neighborhood. So I was always fascinated about kind of relationship. And then, as a sophomore, we had to see the whole Birth movie. I loved it so much, and it like at 16 was making me cry. I watched, I knew we were having this movie was going to be played, and in health or biology or whatever. When I was watching it, I looked at the time to see what time the teacher it was on, like when the baby was actually being born. I looked at the clock. And so I had a period where I didn't have class. I was like a TA for somebody. And when it was about that same time in her class, in another hour, I ran over there and like popped my head in the door to watch the moment when that baby came out. So I knew it's always been a huge, huge fascination of mine. And when I decided to become a nurse, I knew it was going to be a labor and delivery. Like there was no question that that's where I wanted to end up. But when I did start off in med surg, because I knew once I got to labor and delivery, I would die there. It was just, I knew that like that was going to be it. I was not going to want to go anywhere else. It was the dream. And so when I got to labor and delivery, I can't tell you like how much it felt right for me. Like it was the place. Oh my soul needed to be there. And it was just nothing but joy to go to work. Like it was the best job I thought anybody could ever have. So I don't know why, but that's how that unfolded.
Well, I'm sitting here like smiling and chuckling because so much of that story resonates because um, I too declared that I would be a nurse at a very young age. My mom wrote it down in my baby book at 5. I said, I'm going to be a nice nurse. Now, throughout my school, I knew I was probably going to do something in the medical field. I went to a high school that had a medical magnet program. Then, when I had an opportunity in my junior year to do my school did where you spent a week shadowing someone, and at that point I thought, oh, I'm going to be a physical therapist and I'm going to be a pediatric physical therapist. And then I went and did that rotation and was working with pediatric burn patients, and I was just like, there is no way, like, no way I will be able to do this. And so I ended up in nursing, kind of like, but I forgot that I had said that I was going to be a nice nurse. So the power of our words, or just the calling that we have on our life, is so amazing. And I had always thought, I'm going to work with kids. Then I did my pediatric rotation, and I was just like, oh my goodness, these kids are so sick. There was no like ability for me to separate emotionally. Like, it was so hard for me. And I ended up where I said I would never end up, which was in cardiac, because I was like, okay, those people, they're like, mostly they're older. They've lived a life or done things to end up with really poor health. It was easier emotionally for the loss. But the other thing that was so funny is I was that kid on the street that was always trying to help people. I was like tutoring people in the neighborhood when I was like 10. I don't know how I was tutoring, but I was, setting up shop and like, come, I'll work with you. And I took in stray animals. So I'm like, no wonder we just have such an easy time communicating. There's just something in our energy that is very similar. But I love that. And I love how you knew, like, when you stepped into that space, that it was where you were supposed to be. So what were some of the most, we're going to talk about the challenges, and I always like to tell people, like, we're nurses, we love caring for people, we want good outcomes, and we're going to share positives, but we're also going to talk about the negatives, because you cannot transform things you don't talk about. And so we're going to expose some things that have been seen in our own practices as nurses, but with the intent to shine a light and say we can do better and we can do different. So, but let's start with some of the positives of like why you loved being in labor and delivery. And
yeah, the whole birth process to me is just, it's absolutely fascinating. It still fascinates me that, like, you can take these two tiny little cells and literally make a human being. Like, that's actually crazy. Like, it's crazy, right? And it's crazy that most of the time it ends up being like this perfect human, right? Like this perfect human. It's just amazing. So that right there is just, has always fascinated me, to this day still fascinates me. And I loved that it's mostly happy, right? Like, it's 99% of the time it's really, really happy. When it's sad, of course, it's the worst. But it's just such a joyful time. And I loved being part of that experience for somebody else, right? Being in that room. Like, I remember my labor and delivery nurses. So, understanding that impact that we have on every single labor, right? Like, I might have watched 100 babies, thousands of babies be born, but this is maybe her first time. So first time moms were always super exciting to me because of that, right? It's her first time. It's very, very interesting to me. So I love that. In the first 2 years of being a labor and delivery nurse, every time that baby came out, I would cry. It was so funny because there are things and tasks you need to be doing when the baby comes out. And I used to be like so wrapped up in the emotion of, oh my gosh, baby just came out. And it took me literally 2 years to stop crying. And then the second 2 years, so years 3 and 4 of being a labor and delivery nurse, I would cry when the dad would cry. Like it was terrible. And just the other day, maybe 4 months ago, I was in a C-section and the dad, they were having, and they knew it, they were having their fourth boy. And when that baby came out, the dad still cried. And that totally choked me up because usually by the third and fourth child, the dad's not crying, but they're happy. I'm not trying to diss dads or anything, but like
Sure.
he cried like like it was his first. So it was really, it's still very, very exciting to see. So, I still do work in labor day, very part-time. And I still love the process. Like I still love the idea of it, but, it's doesn't hold the same magic that it used to hold for me when I first started. I mean, I've been doing labor and delivery for 28 years, so some of the magic has definitely worn off. But I do still find each case can be very, very different, and those moments when it's a little bit different, a little bit special in a different way is still very exciting for me.
So you're doing this part-time. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of the journey you went through to recognizing like this doesn't have the same alignment. We talked in the intro about a time when you were advocating for a patient. I read this in the book that we'll link to, so people, especially nurses, can read this. It's all about kind of reigniting your passion for what you're doing and why we can lose that. And I'd love for you to just kind of share a little bit from your perspective about what were the things that added up to that place where you were like, I have compassion fatigue, I don't feel in alignment, and I have to do something different now.
It definitely was a process, and not something that happened overnight. I have always been that nurse that wants to work in her community. I find so much joy in like contributing to the society that I am a part of. So whenever I would move hospitals. So I have had my fair share in the last 30 years of being a nurse in different hospitals. So each one kind of had their own, defining moments of where I reached that point of feeling, kind of the compassion fatigue that I experienced. There were some that were worse than others that really kind of sparked that. For the most part, I didn't leave any hospital because of it, except for one. Two. So it becomes this thing where it's not just about like me as a nurse caring for this patient, and it's exhausting because whatever they're in pain or they're complain, whatever it is, whatever the negative that we can associate with taking care of a patient that's challenging and difficult, it becomes, how the interaction is with the physicians, how you are supported by management, what the mission is for the hospital, and actually do they stand by what they say they stand by. All of those things can contribute to compassion fatigue, which is what I experienced. And so the hospital that I'm at right now, I love it so much. Like I truly feel like I'm making a difference when I take care of these patients, but the resources, we lack those, right? And so that becomes very exhausting and difficult when you are trying to be, we all want to be the best nurses, right? Like we didn't go into this to be like half, a partially good nurse. We want to be the best. So when we don't have the resources to do that, that really is upsetting to all of us. And so that's probably what's hard in the situation that I am now, is just the kind of the lack of resources. So when you put all these negative things to like this really positive thing that we're doing, right? We're taking care of people. We're in their greatest moments and their saddest moments and their challenging moments, like all the things that people need support around. And when something interferes with us delivering the best care, that's when compassion fatigue creeps in my opinion.
Yeah, when I read that, what you had written, and I started to kind of think about some of the times, and not just, I haven't been at the bedside for a long time, but where I become frustrated, and because I'm still in healthcare, all the years, is when we lose track of the patient and we don't have the resources. And really, if I said for me what the greatest thing would be, is when I see that the dollar signs are making decisions that are not in the best interest. So we all have to make money. Organizations, hospitals are no different. But when that becomes the primary goal, and there's things that are cut or done that put patients at risk, or doctors making decisions about things that there's financial compensation or things that are motivating it,
Mm-hmm.
for me, that's where I really get frustrated. That, and then on the side of being an advocate for patients, what I see is overworked. You said, not the resources that the nurses need. They don't have the staffing that they need. And that leads to not having the ability to even critically think, because you're just do I've got to, and that really puts patients at risk. And so there have been cases in even recently, where I had a friend and she was in the hospital, and she put me as her patient advocate because they weren't getting things done. They were saying they were doing things and then they weren't. And so when I got involved, eventually we did get her transferred. She was very critically, almost dying, young, in her 30s with a child. And it was so frustrating to see them saying they were doing something and then it not being done. And I get it. They're busy. They may not even know how to navigate it as a more rural hospital to getting the medical transfer. There could be a lot of reasons why that happens, but it's just really not acceptable when people's lives are on the line.
Yeah, yeah, you're exactly right. And there's my husband works in tech, and it's so funny. He whenever like I'm telling him something or frustration or something about like work or the challenges that I'm facing, it's like he's always just so baffled and confused that like the the importance of like what's placed on tech in the software industry versus healthcare and people's lives. It's crazy. It's crazy the difference. This would never happen, right, in high tech. So it's really interesting what the healthcare system is allowed to get away with. And I think the biggest problem is that patients just don't know. Like
Right.
we just don't, they just don't know. We know as nurses, obviously, but my mom was just in the hospital, and I had to battle this whole system that was very, very frustrating. And all I could think of is, at least I know, like I see what they're doing wrong, right? And I'm able to say like, hey, actually no. And it was funny, she was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and towards the end, like there's a bit of a scramble when I came in. And I'm not trying to say I was being really mean, but like I would come in and I was asking questions. Like I was asking questions. I was asking for help. I was doing all the things. And so they would move a little bit different, or already start explaining like what's going to happen or what was going on or whatever. Where if I didn't say anything, it all just seems like it would be like it's okay, like nobody knows any difference. And then if,
Mm-hmm.
let's just say, somebody dies because of a medical malpractice or an accident, whatever the accident, people don't know. They don't know really what was missed, or they don't even have the language to ask the question, right? So it's like it's hard to be in this system. It's hard to be in this system and know how flawed it is and how and how much it's failing people. Like, and there are great nurses out there. I mean, I work with great nurses, and it's still really, really hard to deliver great care. It's almost impossible. The system doesn't allow for it.
Right. I'm so glad you pointed that out about this. The system doesn't allow for it. Like, there's very qualified people, but for some reason, there's things happening that could change. And I'm so glad you were there for your mother. I was thankful to be there for my friend, but not everybody has that, you know?
Right.
It really was clear to me during COVID. And my son is very tall. He went in for an appendicitis, and it had been missed, you know, because we weren't being seen by the doctor. They took him, you know, we had to go through COVID. They thought he was sick, and, you know, no one actually put their hands on him and examined him, right? And so then at the point where it's very clear that it's an appendicitis, and I'm talking to the doctor, and I'm worried about taking him in because I don't want to, how will they let me stay and all of that? And they're like, yes, he's a pediatric patient. But as soon as I walked in the doors, because he's, you know, over 6 foot tall, he was at that point 17 and a half. Thank God he was not 18 yet. And we come in, they're like, oh, you need to stay out. And I'm like, oh no, he's a pediatric patient. Already told his doctor, like, but if I had not been there, because they didn't want to take him to, they weren't wanting to take people to surgery. So they wanted to cool him off with antibiotics and see if that would work. Well, he was septic by that night, and he was not in a critical care. I was thankfully there, and I was a critical care nurse. I'm like, get the critical care nurses in here, you know, like fighting. That doctor did not come in until the afternoon. And that was because I was about to transfer him to another hospital, because I had been taking video, pictures, sending them to my friend who's a nurse practitioner at the same system, but a different hospital in the general surgery department. And her surgeon said, I will take him, and I will take him to surgery. And he was so sick. And I mean, they were holding his pain meds because his blood pressure was so low. He had no urine output, but they were giving him all this fluids. It was just like awful. And even with someone advocating, and I was getting angry. And that doctor after surgery calls me and he's like, you were right. He was really sick. I'm like, no, like, I'm like, and we ended up being in the hospital for 2 weeks.
Wow.
For how sick he was. And what would have happened if I hadn't been there? And that is the moment too, for me, that I was just like, we have to talk about these things. It's not about, you know, bad mouthing stressed care providers and where things, like, it was COVID. So I get it, but we have to do a better job. And so that's what you're doing now. You've found something, you've shifted in your role, and we're going to talk about that in our next episode. So awesome. I hope people will come back and just, you know, thanks for sharing that. Your story is just such a powerful reminder that sometimes even the most fulfilling roles can come with challenges, and they force us to grow. So we're going to talk about how you stepped away from the hospital in a full-time position, and you found your niche as a nurse coach, and you began a mission to make a lasting impact. So you guys, don't forget to like and subscribe to It's Your Story to Tell so that you catch the next episode. We look forward to being back with you.
Thanks, Megan.